Oh, hey, it's you. Come on in. You're just in time for another episode of PsychFlix. Today we're going to be talking about the Oscar-nominated movie, The Imitation Game. Come on in and learn some more about Allen Turing. I'm Jess Willens, and welcome back to another episode of PsychFlix, where each week we analyze a current or popular movie from a psychological perspective, often zeroing in on one character, trying to worm our way into their heads to figure out what makes them tick, so that you can better understand the characters you love or hate. So, as I mentioned in the intro, today we're going to be talking about one of the most acclaimed movies of 2014, The Imitation Game. Now, it was nominated for 8 Oscars. It won 1 Oscar on Sunday night, if you were watching the Oscars. It won for Best Adapted Screenplay. But what we're going to be talking about today is the character of Allen Turing, played by Benedict Cumberbatch. And one of the things that really struck me as I watched it is clearly this was a brilliant guy who was extremely socially awkward. And they really portrayed him as having Aspergers, or being on the Autistic Spectrum. Now, some reviewers of the movie weren't sure that they necessarily liked that, because they said that the real Allen Turing wasn't quite that socially awkward. He certainly didn't have a diagnosis of Asperger's, but that wasn't a common diagnosis back then anyway, so it's not surprising that he didn't have the diagnosis. And they said that he had a lot of friends, but there were also many people who did say that he was a little socially awkward. He certainly thought differently than the average person did, and therefore interacted with people a little differently than the average person. So perhaps it was a little bit exaggerated in the movie, but that's okay with me. I think it's good for us to understand this disorder. And it's actually, even though it's classified as a disorder in the DSM-4, which is and now the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual for mental health disorders, it's really shouldn't be even considered a disorder. It's just a different way that people's brains work. Now, you may know someone who is on the autistic spectrum, someone who has been diagnosed with Asperger's, and it's a really big spectrum. You think of, one end of the spectrum, fully autistic would be like Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man. That's fully autistic.
1949 Buick Roadmaster, straight 8, Fireball 8. Only 8,095 production models. Dad lets me drive slow on a driveway, but not on Monday. Definitely not on Monday.
But there's lots of, it's a very large spectrum, and on the other end of the spectrum are people who function relatively normally in society. They have jobs, they're married, they have families, they do different things, but they're a little bit socially awkward. You can tell that they're a little bit different because their minds work differently than the rest of ours. And now, I thought that the movie The Imitation Game did a really good job of showing sort of how his mind worked differently, how he didn't quite get a lot of social cues that the rest of us would get. And so that's what I want to talk about today. So there were a couple really good scenes at the beginning of the movie that really showed the awkward social tendencies that Allen Turing had, at least as portrayed in the movie. There was a great scene when he was a kid and he was at school and he was talking with his friend. They were talking about codes and how to break codes. And the young Allen Turing said something like, "How is that any different than the way people talk to each other?" His friend was like, What do you mean?" He said, "Well, because when people talk to each other, but it seems like they never actually say what they mean. What they say is completely different than what they actually mean, and yet it seems like people always know exactly what the other person means. But I don't get it. I don't understand why people don't just say what they mean." And that's what his friend said, "I have the feeling you're going to be really good at this code stuff." And of course, he did become good at the code stuff. There was also the scene right at the very beginning of the movie when he's being interviewed by one of the leading generals in the English army, and you could tell that interview was not going real well, and the general was just about ready to dismiss Allen Turing. "Get out of here! I don't have time to waste my time with you," because Allen Turing really couldn't communicate very effectively with him. But once he mentioned Enigma, which was the code machine that the Germans were using that the English were trying to break, suddenly he got the general's interest.
I like solving problems, Commander. And Enigma is the most difficult problem in the world.
No, Enigma isn't difficult, it's impossible. The Americans, the Russians, the French, the Germans, everyone thinks Enigma is unbreakable.
Good. Let me try, and we'll know for sure, won't we?
And then there was another great scene, if you remember, early in the movie when they had first assembled this team. The English army had assembled a team of these brilliant mathematicians and linguists to try and break the German Enigma machine. And one of Allen Turing's fellow workers said,
"The boys, we're going to get some lunch." Alan?
Yes?
I said we're going to get some lunch. Alan?
Yes?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I said we're off to get some lunch. This is starting to get a little bit repetitive.
What is?
I had asked if you wanted to come to lunch with us.
No, you didn't. You said you were going to get some lunch.
The scene continued, and it even got more awkward from there. It was a funny scene, but I loved it because as a practicing therapist, I have worked with people who have Asperger's disorder. They are on the autistic spectrum, and that is exactly what interacting with them can sometimes feel like. And a number of my clients who have had Asperger's are actually adolescents, and you can imagine just how adolescents treat other adolescents who are socially awkward. Sometimes they get bullied, they get picked on. Often the kids with Asperger's disorder, they don't fit in, they don't have a lot of friends, and therefore they struggle at school, not because they're not smart, but because they can't communicate with their peers. They often can't even communicate with their teachers. Their way of learning is different than the rest of us. And so they sometimes have some difficulties fitting in society. But they are incredibly talented and incredibly smart. And so I just want to explain a little bit as to what causes Asperger's. Just like with Alan Turing, he didn't understand. He said people don't ever say what they actually mean. And that was the case then in the scene where the guy said, "We're going to go to lunch." Well, what the guy really meant is, "Do you want to come to lunch with us?" But that's not what he said. Well, all of us, we understand what the guy means when he says, "We're going to go to lunch." But Alan didn't, because he would have assumed that if the guy wanted him to go to lunch, he would say, "Hey, do you want to come to lunch with us?" But that's not what he said. And when we interact with other people, there's millions and millions of social cues that most of us just get. And we're picking up on facial expressions, we're picking up on vocal intonations, we understand phrases and what they mean and what people are talking about. And our brains are working really, really, really hard to understand these millions of social cues. But you take an Asperger's brain, and instead of working really hard to understand these millions of social cues, they're taking all of that energy and putting it into what their brain considers far more useful stuff. And sometimes it is more useful stuff. That's the reason why Alan Turing was an incredible mathematician. His brain wasn't working to try and decode and decipher these millions of social cues. His brain was working to try and decode and decipher, difficult, complex mathematical codes. And he did, lucky for us, otherwise we'd all be speaking German right now. And that's the case with most people who have Asperger's disorder, is they can do things that the average Joe, you and I, can't do. And we should be grateful for them. We should be grateful for the Allen Turings of the world. We should be grateful for anyone we know that has Asperger's, because our society and our world simply wouldn't be the same without them. So, is it sometimes difficult to communicate with them and interact with them? Yeah, it is. But we need them, and we need to learn how to interact with them. And I have greatly treasured all of the opportunities I've had to get to know people with Asperger's disorder, to get to learn a little bit more and understand a little bit more of their unique way of thinking and of seeing the world. And I hope that's something that all of us can do in our lives, because I bet you we all know someone who is somewhere on the autistic spectrum. So those are the things that I liked about the movie The Imitation Game. If there were some things you liked or that you liked specifically about the character Alan Turing, mention in the comments section below. Or if you just have some comments you'd like to make about people with Asperger's or anyone you know who's on the autistic spectrum, please comment in the comments section below. Once again, please do not forget to subscribe to this channel, Cine-Love, where you can have access to all of Lane's movie reviews and my PsychFlix videos each week. And you can check out my blog, The Unfailed Self. And once again, until next week, this is PsychFlix.